Imagine waking up in a medieval village. You're thirsty. What do you reach for? If you've watched any movie or TV show set in the Middle Ages, you already know the answer everyone assumes. Beer, because water supposedly would kill you. Here's the problem. That's almost entirely false. This is one of those historical facts that has been repeated so many times in so many shows by so many well-meaning teachers that nobody bothers to question it anymore. Medieval people drank beer instead of water because the water was too dirty to survive. Case closed. Everyone nods. Moving on. Except the actual historical record tells a very different story. And once you start pulling on this thread, the whole thing unravels embarrassingly fast. Let's be honest about where this idea comes from, because it's not really coming from historians. It's coming from television. Vikings, The Tudors, Game of Thrones. Somewhere in the writer's room of one of these shows, someone decided that having every character constantly swigging from a tankard of ale looked more authentic, more gritty, more medieval, and it stuck. Not because it was true, but because it looked right on screen. A peasant clutching a wooden cup of beer just feels more Middle Ages than a peasant clutching a bucket of water. So the myth got baked into our collective imagination, one dramatic drinking scene at a time. But here's the question we actually need to ask. And it's not the question most people think they're asking. The real question isn't when did medieval people start drinking alcohol instead of water. The real question is whether that switch ever happened at all. And if it didn't, what was actually going on with water throughout the medieval period? Because the answer to that turns out to be far more interesting than the myth it replaces. Let's start with the most basic assumption baked into this whole myth, that medieval water was universally filthy and dangerous. It wasn't. Most medieval villages weren't built at random. They were built next to something specific. A spring, a well, a stream, a river bend that stayed clean year-round. Access to reliable, drinkable water was one of the very first considerations in choosing where to settle a village in the first place. You don't build your home, raise your children, and plan to live out your entire life somewhere without a dependable water source. That's not medieval logic. And there's another factor working in medieval water's favor that we tend to forget entirely. Population density. Medieval Europe, especially outside the handful of larger cities, simply didn't have that many people crowded into small areas. Fewer people means less waste, less runoff, less contamination pressure on any given water source. A well that served 40 families in a small village faced nowhere near the contamination risk of, say, a 19th century industrial slum, crammed with thousands of people, and no sanitation infrastructure at all. Ironically, medieval water sources were often cleaner than water in much later, more advanced periods of history. Now, let's talk about beer, because this is where the myth completely falls apart under its own weight. If beer wasn't a substitute for water, what was it? The honest answer is it was food. Liquid food. Medieval beer and ale were nothing like the beer you'd buy today. We're talking about something with an alcohol content hovering somewhere around 1 to 3%, closer to what you'd call barely there by modern standards. Nobody was getting drunk off their daily ration of ale the way modern beer would get you drunk. What they were getting was calories, carbohydrates, energy. For farmers and laborers doing brutal physical work from sunrise to sunset, a mug of low-alcohol ale functioned less like a drink and more like a protein bar functions for us today. It wasn't chosen over water because water was dangerous. It was consumed alongside water because the body needed fuel, and grain-based ale was an efficient filling way to get it. And if you think the idea that water was too dangerous to drink comes from medieval medicine itself, you'd be wrong there too. Quite the opposite, actually. Medieval medical texts didn't warn people away from water. Many of them actively recommended it. The 7th century Byzantine physician Paul of Aegina wrote about water being one of the most useful substances in any healthy regimen, praising water that was pure, pleasant to drink, and free of strong taste or smell. The Salernitan Rule of Health, one of the most widely circulated medical guides of the medieval period, gave specific advice on which types of water were best for your health. This is not the language of a civilization terrified of its own water supply. This is the language of people who understood water, evaluated its quality, and recommended it as part of a healthy life. There's also a much simpler, much more human explanation hiding in plain sight, and it's an economic one. Water was free, beer was not. Someone had to grow the grain, malt it, brew it, and either sell it to you or trade for it. Unless you were brewing it yourself at home, beer cost money, time, and labor to produce. Water, meanwhile, was sitting right there in the village well, completely free, for anyone with a bucket. Ask yourself honestly, why would an entire civilization, spanning 1,000 years and dozens of cultures, collectively decide to spend money and labor replacing something free and safe with something expensive, just out of habit? It doesn't hold up. So where did this myth actually come from, if not from the historical record itself? Part of it comes from literature, specifically from characters like Shakespeare's Falstaff, a boisterous, perpetually drinking comic figure who left a lasting cultural impression of medieval and early modern life as one long drunken party. Part of it comes from monastic tradition. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed daily life for monks, made allowances for monks to drink beer, since expecting anyone to survive on water alone was considered unreasonably harsh. Over time, in the high medieval period, monastic beer allowances became remarkably generous, and ordinary people, watching monks enjoy their daily beer ration, followed suit as best they could afford. But the biggest source of this myth might be us, modern audiences looking back at a period before chlorination, before water treatment plants, before anyone understood germ theory, and assuming that no modern science must mean undrinkable water. We projected our own anxieties about contamination onto a past that, in reality, understood its local water sources extremely well and trusted them enough to build entire villages around them. The real twist here isn't that medieval people drank water despite drinking beer. It's that they drank both, every single day, without treating one as an emergency backup for the other. Think about your own life for a second. You probably drink coffee in the morning. You also drink water throughout the day. You don't consider these two things substitutes for each other. Nobody looks at their water bottle and thinks, well, I already had coffee, so I guess I don't need this. They serve completely different purposes, and you reach for whichever one fits the moment. That is almost exactly how medieval people related to beer and water. Beer wasn't a replacement, it was an addition. There's a written account from a 14th century monk that captures this perfectly. When asked to rank his preferred drinks, he placed water above beer, not because beer was dangerous or forbidden, but simply because, on a personal level, he liked water more. Think about how strange that detail is if you actually believe the popular myth. If water were genuinely a death sentence, a monk casually stating a personal preference for it would be almost unthinkable. Instead, it reads exactly like someone today saying they prefer sparkling water over soda. It's a preference, not a survival strategy. There's an even more revealing piece of evidence buried in an old English teaching text, a kind of dialogue used to instruct young monks in Latin conversation. In it, a boy is asked what he drinks. His answer is simple and almost offhand: beer, if he has it, or water, if he doesn't. Sit with that phrasing for a second. Water isn't presented as the desperate fallback option you turn to when nothing else is available and you're willing to risk your life. It's presented exactly the other way around. Water is the default. Beer is the treat, the extra, the thing you drink when you happen to have it on hand. If water had actually been the dangerous option, no responsible adult would have taught that line to a child as an unremarkable everyday answer. And this pattern shows up at a much larger scale too. Medieval towns and cities didn't just passively hope for clean water to show up. Larger urban centers built actual infrastructure to move water where it was needed: pipe systems, public conduits, and civic funding specifically dedicated to keeping water flowing into fountains and collection points that ordinary citizens could access. You don't build permanent stone infrastructure, funded by town councils, maintained across generations, in order to deliver something everyone secretly believed would kill you. Infrastructure like that only gets built for a resource people actually trust and actually want. So why does this myth still have such a grip on us? Part of the answer is almost flattering to us, in an uncomfortable way. There's something satisfying about imagining our ancestors as slightly ridiculous, stumbling through life mildly drunk because they simply didn't know any better, while we in the modern world finally figured it out. It lets us feel like we've climbed out of some grim, unsanitary past into an enlightened present. The myth isn't just wrong, it's flattering, and flattering myths are always harder to kill than boring, accurate ones. And this isn't even a uniquely medieval problem. We do a version of the exact same thing today. Plenty of people distrust their own tap water for no real reason beyond a vague cultural anxiety, despite it being tested, treated, and regulated far more rigorously than almost any water source in human history. They buy bottled water instead, convinced it's somehow safer, cleaner, more trustworthy, often with little to no evidence that it actually is. We like to imagine that fear of bad water is a relic of some less advanced past. In reality, it might say more about present-day anxiety than it does about anything medieval people actually believed.